Originally one of the great exclusive titles for the PlayStation 3, Valkyria Chronicles has found its way onto the PC and PlayStation 4. Its distinct visual style most definitely turned a few heads back in 2008, but the game itself never found significant traction amongst mainstream audiences. Part strategy RPG, part JRPG, part medieval fantasy, part World War II recreation, this game finds itself somewhat hard to categorize. But is the game any good? Well, as you might tell from the length of the video, that's a question that garners a complex answer. Now, before we get started, I just want to say that this review is kind of spoiler-filled, so just be aware of that going into it. Valkyria Chronicles has some very unique goals in terms of its style and tone. Its main goal is to create this storybook adventure of good and evil, and a young hero rising to the task of saving his homeland. I don't think this is just my interpretation, because the game is literally told through a storybook, as well as the entire game being framed around parchment, as if the events are drawings on a watercolour. Interestingly enough, it combines World War II with medieval fantasy, from its story to its design. All Gallian soldiers have these elements of plate armor in their uniforms, and Imperial soldiers' uniforms are like that of armored knights. The Imperial helmets look like a combination of the German Sallet and Stechhelm. The Panzerfaust equivalent in this series are designed to look like giant decorative tournament lancers. Other than these lancers, the weapons are heavily based on World War II weapons, with the Gewehr 43, Sturmgewehr, MP40, and maybe a little bit of FG42 here. The weapon design is only the surface of the World War II elements, and the world of Valkyria Chronicles is shaped around 20th century war and politics. The autocratic East European Imperial Alliance is based mostly on a combination of World War I and World War II Germany and Russia. Geographically, it shares a similar position to Russia as well. It is a military of numbers and force, like the Russian military, but is also mentioned to be engaging in mobile armor blitzkrieg tactics. It also has, as its title suggests, an emperor, so harkening back to a German Kaiser or a Russian Tsar. But then you also have the Atlantic Federation, which is closer in resemblance to Western democracies. The Federation, a union of democratic states, is similar in concept to that of the European Union, as well as geographically occupying the same space as the EU. Their tactics involve using spies and nasty diplomacy, like putting despots into foreign nations. So, trying to mirror real-life Western 20th century tactics. It's fairly interesting how these real-world elements have been woven into the game, and it gives you a good sense for the nastiness of these big nations. Gallia is most likely based on Finland during the Winter War, being invaded by a much larger but poorly organised power, and overcoming great odds. Although there's this medieval fantasy element to the game, much of the backstory and detail in the game mirrors real-world examples, so it never feels too fantastical. It really tries to get the right balance with its world writing. One of the central artists for the game who helped form a lot of the look and style behind things is Honjo Raita. I'm not sure how to introduce him, but let me say it's certainly an interesting choice to put him as the main artist in a mainstream video game project, and that there's official Valkyria Chronicles art of his that I probably wouldn't be able to show you on YouTube. You just have to look him up. He is a talented artist though, and his work does the game justice. Raita is mainly responsible for all the main character designs, and helped develop a lot of the tone of the game with his art. That's not to say it's all Raita art in the game. Daisuke Tabayashi does a lot of the grunt work, and his art is what influences what a lot of the final version of the game looks like. Both very talented, and I definitely praise this game for its art direction. It's actually quite a hard line to balance these realistic and fantasy elements, and while I can't quite say if they did the best job possible, it's certainly close. If you do have a bit of spare cash, I highly recommend buying the Valkyria Chronicles Design Archive. It really goes into an incredible amount of detail, and you get a really good sense for how the game developed over time. The overall story is nothing to write home about. It's not a bad story, but it's not going to leave too deep of an impression on you. But I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, since no game can do everything perfect, and Valkyria Chronicles' presentation and gameplay are unique and interesting enough to carry it. In a broad sense, I will say that I think it's a little confused with what story exactly it's trying to tell. In many ways, the story of Valkyria Chronicles is a JRPG-like story with a big evil boss character and giant unstoppable plot device machines. I just don't think that JRPG style of plot really translates to the gameplay or the background behind the game. For example, in the final part of the game, you have numerous missions dedicated to defeating or thwarting these bosses. They're not particularly strategic or militaristic, and it doesn't really feel like it blends with all the other elements in the game, where the story is actively making the game less fun to play. But it's not just the overall plot that brings the game down, but also the little inconsistencies in the approach to its story. There are some really stupid parts that will always make my eyes roll no matter how many times I play the game. Seriously, this pig is so stupid, it even got a place on the damn cover of the re-release. But it has its good moments too, where it feels mature and interesting. So how good the story is can really depend on what the scene is and how far it is on the cliche JRPG scale. Characters are a bit more of a highlight than the story, I would say. It's not amazing character writing, but every single character at least gets a moment or two to shine through. When it comes to major offenders, main character Welkin and his sister Isara are pretty flat and boring. Welkin's nature lover gimmick might have been a little more interesting if it wasn't all made up babble, and Isara is unrealistically goody-goody. Alicia has a lot of interesting character stuff surrounding her, but none of it feels particularly developed. Rosie and Largo, though, are probably the highlights of the main cast. They come from interesting backgrounds and have good character arcs. Gameplay-wise, this game is very unique. It has a class system with separate unit types that perform different roles, something that's typical in SRPGs, sure, but it's how they interact that makes the game so interesting. It's like this fusion of a typical turn-based SRPG with real-time third-person shooter combat. It's much more hands-on than a typical SRPG since you manually move units across the field. And because of that hands-on element, the game is very engaging. It's good that it plays as uniquely as it does because the core strategy element of the game isn't exactly deep, since it revolves around fairly typical unit roles who perform very basic actions. The height of strategy is probably where you try to get more than one kill per action, which frankly is a bit pathetic considering that this is an SRPG. There's a big emphasis on characters in this game, where your soldiers aren't faceless and have a lot of personality to them. You might think that this is somewhat undisciplined for soldiers, but it's more believable since they're part of the militia and not the main army. You can recruit from a list of 40 characters, making a total of 43 deployable soldiers. The interesting part is that each unit has a set of potentials that heavily influence how you use the character. So the depth in the game comes from the characters and how you use their personal traits. What's even more interesting is that not all the characters are balanced equally, and there are some flat out terrible selections to choose from. This might sound like a negative, but it's actually very thematic since your militia aren't regular army soldiers, and it's your job as squad commander to pick out who is and who isn't fit for service. Also, certain squad members are friends with each other and can team up for attacks, as well as having unique lines for when interacting with one another. They also have their own personal profile that will detail their background and their contribution to the squad. It's very Suikoden-like, and your soldiers are one of the highlights of the game. For the record, my favorite characters are Marina, Nina, Wendy, Jane, Elise, and of course, Aika and Vice. Units have very hard caps on the effective range of their weapons, where a couple steps in a direction can determine whether you kill an enemy or barely graze them. It's just a bit of a frustrating mechanic and really limits the strategy you can employ with units. For example, if you wanted to use a shock trooper as a defensive unit, they will either not fire at all or they will decimate anything within 5 meters. This really translates to a lack of strong defensive options, and any time defense is called for in a mission, it actually requires a rigorous offense. The game in many ways is not built on the use of defensive strategy or tactics, which leaves a whole section of gameplay completely unrefined. For the weapons, I personally would have liked lower damage but with a longer drop off. Balance-wise, the game is a mix of being inconsistent and easy. In the early game, your weapons are so inaccurate and you have access to very little orders that the game will put up a little bit of a fight, but it's not long before you can start to steamroll the opposition with ease. So, the early game is more difficult than the late game. Not to mention that there are some flat out hard missions in the early game and some insultingly easy ones in the late game. When it comes to the subject of balance though, it's orders that are the main culprit. This game has become known for its Scout Rush, where you place as many orders as you need on Alicia and send her out to conquer everything. Rankings are based on speed, not enemies killed, commanders killed, tanks destroyed, or camps captured, which means you can ace the game by using the laziest tactics. Outside of Scout Rushing, orders can flip the balance of things completely. For a majority of the game, shock troopers and sometimes scouts are more useful tank destroyers than lancers or even your personal tank. The lancer is an almost completely redundant unit for most of the game and only becomes useful again at level 20, which most people are not going to unlock through just playing the main story. On the topic of redundant units, while they're not completely so, engineers really don't feel much of a role during the game. Sure, for certain actions here and there, but honestly they're just weaker scouts with less movement, so there really isn't much of an incentive to use them consistently. Even outside order abuse, the game on its normal difficulty doesn't really heed much of a challenge. Without orders, it might take an extra turn, maybe 2, but you'll rarely find yourself with a struggle. Ranks are also passed out pretty leniently for the most part, and I think you'd have to royally mess up in order to get under a B rank. Not to mention that save scumming is allowed during missions, something that I never even knew you could do until the PlayStation 4 release. So you can make the easy game even easier. If you save scum during Valkyria Chronicles, please rethink how you play the game. My complaints in regards to the difficulty would be irrelevant if there were selectable difficulty modes, but there are no difficulty options for the main game. People are going to be at different skill levels whenever they go into games, and you really need to accommodate that. There are difficulty options for skirmishes, however. There's easy, which isn't really worth talking about. Hard mode, however, is. They really try to flood the map with as many enemies as possible, and there are a lot of units out to destroy your tank to make you game over fast. It's still not a big leap in difficulty though, and with some slow, precise tactics you can still beat the levels without a sweat. Or alternatively, you can Scout Rush, which is almost as easy as it is on normal difficulty. But there's one more difficulty level, Expert. This was originally for DLC for the PlayStation 3, but it's packaged with the remaster. This Expert difficulty is balls to the wall difficult, but awesome at the same time. You have no tank, no orders, and your units have level 1 defense. With each mission, you have to escort Welcome to a certain point on the map, and it's game over if he goes down. This mode really requires patience and planning. You really do have to strategize well and have good unit combinations, or otherwise it will bite you in the ass hard. This mode is a lot of fun and really demonstrates just how coddling orders are in the first place. Expert level Brawl really made me feel like I was controlling a squad through a French village in World War II. Dodging artillery fire, snipers hidden in bombed out buildings and forcing you to approach slowly and use the abilities of every member of the squad. The extra difficulty made it feel much more thematic, and I wish the entire game was playable like this. If I had to say one issue with this mode, it's that your unit's defense is too low, and you will get shredded even by scout interception fire. It would have been better if player unit defense was only moderately reduced, but enemy defense was moderately increased, since the Imperials have the same defense as they do on hard mode. Another thing aiding in the game's easy difficulty is the fact that the AI is not particularly intelligent. It never seems to react to how you play, and almost seems scripted. A fairly accurate example of the game's bad AI and its almost scripted like nature is just how enemies will just walk right into fire constantly throughout the game. So you're never really fighting an intelligent enemy, just an enemy with numbers. Balance isn't limited to just difficulty though. A lot of weapon balance in this game is very poor. There are these weapon trees in R&D, but almost every one of these trees are broken. The semi-automatic rifle, sniper rifle, and submachine gun tree has a branch of weapons with the weakest performance, but dedicated to dealing ailments like reduced aim, defense, attack, etc. The thing is, the best ailment to inflict on an enemy is their death. So these weapons are totally useless, meaning that the 3 branches of the tree are more like 2. The damage-oriented snipers are questionable. The poison flamethrower is extremely situational as opposed to the damage-oriented flamethrower, and mortars for lancers are extremely situational. There were never particularly many weapon choices to begin with, so when many of them are completely redundant, it really removes any sense of choice you have with your equipment. Balance in general is truly a critical fault with this game. The music in this game is good and very fitting. It has this very medieval storybook sound, if you get my meaning, but I would ultimately say that I'm not a huge fan of it. That's not to say I dislike it or I think it's bad, I just think it lacks impact and emotion. During combat, the tracks are just too mellow to really send home the gravity of what is transpiring, and it can flatten the entire feeling of battle. The tracks outside of battle are suitable, but not particularly memorable either. If I were to think of another soundtrack with a similar epic, adventurous musical tone, it would have to be the Soul Calibur series. Pick any game in the series and put some of its tracks to Valkyria Chronicles and it really enhances the game.
私の出番ね。負けるもんか。
圧倒的速やかに遂行せよ。
避けられないんだから。そこ。
辺りをよく確認しておけ。
私の出番ね。負けるもんか。
圧倒的速やかに遂行せよ。
避けられないんだから。そこ。
Now I understand that this is a bit of a subjective point I'm making, but I do stand by my statement that the music lacks impact and emotion. It's good, it's fitting, it's very listenable, but it doesn't excite me, motivate me, or stick with me. On the subject of sound, the sound effects in the game are overall fairly average. Gunshots and explosives are very dull and lack impact. The reload sound effect is an overused stock reload sound, which would be okay, but it's a really crummy one. This same reload effect is used across all weapons, so each weapon becomes a bit less distinct because of that. So a lot of the combat sounds you hear from the game are flat and are very distant from anything visceral sounding. When designing the game, they clearly knew that battles with just music would be very barren sonically. So radio chatter and distant gunfire is added to give a sense of a soundscape. That's the idea, and they're good additions, but not especially good. Distant battle effects sound flat, and the radio chatter is fairly monotonous. I would say that sound across the board is acceptable, but that's it. It's important to any game to have good sound, but in a war/military game where things need to be really visceral, it becomes noticeable when your sound isn't great. The voice acting in this game is typical of a lot of English dubs where it is completely all over the shop. Now, I'm not one of those Japanese-only purists who believe that the Japanese writing and acting has no faults, But at the same time, the track record of English dubs is usually very inconsistent compared to the Japanese originals. It's not all the English voice actors' fault since they're under greater restrictions than the original Japanese cast, which can encroach on their performance ability. But the voice actor does matter a lot, which is why I say things can be quite inconsistent. Hedy Brues and Fred Tatasciore, who voice Rosie and Largo, do a great job and really bring out the characters that they portray. It's really a shame that Hedy Brues isn't in more stuff since I think she's really talented. Steve Blum and Robin Atkin Downes, who voice Zaka and Foldio, are both voice actors I really love a lot, and it's usually quite difficult to find a role that they're not great in. They just have the best voices. Colleen O'Shaughnessy's Alicia is decent, but her delivery can be a little flat since she seems to lack tonal range when she's in character. Wilkin is voiced by Dave Wittenberg, and my god, is he just this amazing personality vacuum. Just awful. Completely flat and boring, can't emote, has no tonal range, and his voice is annoying. Just listen to a comparison between the two tank commanders voiced by Steve Blum and Dave Wittenberg.
Minor damage taken! Under minor fire!
Sounds like he got hit with a damn pebble, not a damn rocket or a cannon round. Just terrible. Susumu Chiba mops the goddamn floor with Dave Wittenberg in every single way. I've saved Isara for last because I have a point to make. Isara is voiced by the great Laura Bailey, but she doesn't do the best job with Isara. Just flat and unmemorable overall. I think it's just a case where Laura Bailey is simply miscast, which is one of the biggest reasons English dubs can be somewhat lackluster, is because of miscast voice actors. No matter how good the actor or actress is, if they're cast in the wrong role, then they stick out like a sore thumb. This kind of applies to the Japanese original cast too, where yes, these people are veterans with a lot of successful roles, but just because someone has a good track record, it doesn't mean that they're perfect for the role they're in now. I'm not implying that the original Japanese is poor in any way, but it's not untouchable. I'd take Hedy Brues over Megami Toyoguchi without a thought. When it comes to the quality of your soldiers' voices, quality differs wildly, and unsurprisingly, ones with better voice actors tend to sound better. I really wanted to be able to tell you which language option is better, but it's just too hard. There are definitely some characters who sound much better in Japanese, like Nina and Marina, but there are also some characters who sound much better in English, like Musad and Wendy. And of course, everything in between. Just one last point on the subject of voice acting. One of the big things that gets attributed under the acting is actually the writing itself, where sometimes it's not the voice actor who is stiff, but the writing. And subpar writing will sometimes be unfairly blamed on the voice actor's performance. Something you see a lot of when English writers translate games from Japanese is that they tend to drop in a bit more Western style personality within the text. This is sometimes appropriate since some have a distinctly Japanese way of speaking with a lot of culturally specific slang, which just doesn't translate over. But also, Japanese lines can sometimes be flat out repetitive. It can be a bit tiring to hear different variations of Teki Hakken and Yatta. But this is where we go back to the inconsistencies of English translations and dubs. For example, Marina's English dialogue feels pretty distant from her character's personality, where the translator/rewriter was trying to make her more interesting but didn't consider the character at all, where adding that extra element of Western style personality crossed over into being inappropriate. This example is a microcosm of some of the questionable translations in this game, and many other Japanese games with English translations. Final note, the subtitles in this game are for the English dialogue and not for the Japanese dialogue, so if you do play with the original Japanese and with subtitles, you're not going to get a very true experience, since sometimes subtitles can be saying completely different things than the Japanese dialogue. I've talked quite extensively about the voice acting enough already, but if you want my opinion, I think both are good. I prefer to play in English, but I completely understand the choice to go with Japanese. I want to dig back into sales, where Valkyria Chronicles wasn't a great success in the East or West, which in a roundabout way led to its sequels being on the PSP. Well, why wasn't it a success? This is really a bit of a tough question because the game got plenty of good reviews, the game itself was distinct, graphically it looked quite nice at the time, and there seems to be a little bit of something for everyone within the game. So if I were to search for an issue with this game, other than balance, I would have to say it would be tone. It can go from "Oni-chan, let's go for a beach episode," and "Senpai, eat my tezukuri pan," to forced labor camps and allusions to Einsatzgruppen. A serious event happens in the story, and the game has this epic song with flashbacks, and it is just so whacked out tonally. It's bending a bit far in either direction, and I think people who want a realistic war drama or the people who want some kind of waifu battle simulator aren't really going to be appeased by what the game offers. As I previously said, Valkyria Chronicles has this storybook-like tone, but when you put some thought into it, this storybook-like tone of a World War II story is really not something anyone was really clamoring for, or something particularly revolutionary. It makes you think who specifically they were aiming this game towards. This clumsy approach is, in my opinion, why the game failed to reach the success it had hoped. No true way to market the game, since the game itself is fundamentally confused. This video game is truly one of the most flawed gems produced by its industry. You can really feel the time and effort that went into the game. It is truly a game unlike any other, from its deep and extensive design to its unique gameplay. But it also feels confused and inconsistent of what kind of game it actually wants to be, and the game takes a major toll because of that. Its very unique gameplay systems are undercooked in almost every facet. It is quite fundamentally in almost every area an especially flawed game. However, it's a game unlike any other, a truly one-of-a-kind experience that has left a deep impression on me. That to me is worth more than another relatively well-crafted game with an absolutely unoriginal concept. A truly unique experience is something very hard to come by no matter what the medium, and Valkyria Chronicles can say it delivers on that.